On the morning of July the 7th, 1944, on the scorched coral dust island of Saipan, Captain Ben Salomon was not thinking about tactics or grand strategy or the geopolitical implications of the Pacific War. He was thinking about teeth. He was thinking about sepsis and sutures and the overwhelming humidity that made the air inside his aid station feel like a wet wool blanket. At 29 years old, Salomon was a dentist. By training, by temperament, and by trade, he was a man dedicated to preservation, not destruction. He wore the Red Cross brassard, a symbol that under the Geneva Convention theoretically offered him protection from the violence raging a few hundred yards away. But the theories of international law had long since evaporated in the brutal heat of the Marianas. What Ben Salomon did not know, what the commanders of the 105th Infantry Regiment did not fully grasp in those pre-dawn hours, was that the ground beneath their feet was about to become the site of the largest suicidal banzai charge in the history of the Pacific War. General Yoshitsugu Saito, realizing defeat was inevitable, had issued his final order. Every man capable of walking, including the wounded, the sick, and the unarmed, was to advance. They were not attacking to win. They were attacking to die and to take as many Americans with them as possible. To understand why a dentist would end up manning a machine gun alone against a horde of thousands, you have to understand the specific nightmare of Saipan. This was not the civilized maneuvering of the European theatre where surrenders were negotiated. This was a collision of ideologies that viewed surrender as a spiritual, moral failure. The Japanese forces, starving and cut off from supply lines, had dissolved into a desperate, feral organism. Salomon was operating a forward aid station, roughly 50 yards behind the front lines. In the logic of 1944 combat, this was supposed to be a zone of relative safety, a place where the broken were mended before being moved to the rear. But the logic of the battlefield was about to be inverted. At 0445, the silence broke. It didn't break with the calculated rhythm of artillery, but with a human roar. 3,000 Japanese soldiers, followed by civilians armed with bamboo spears, surged forward like a tidal wave. They crashed into the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry, overrunning the perimeter in minutes. The doctrine of the US Army Medical Corps was clear. Medical personnel were to treat the wounded, not fight. They carried sidearms for self-defense, but they were not infantry. They were not supposed to be the last line of defense. But as the American lines collapsed under the sheer weight of the Japanese assault, the aid station ceased to be a hospital and became a fortress. Salomon was working on a wounded soldier when the canvas of his tent was slashed open. A Japanese soldier lunged in, bayonet fixed. In that fraction of a second, the dentist vanished, and the soldier emerged. Salomon grabbed an M1 rifle that was lying near a wounded patient. He didn't hesitate. He fired, dropping the attacker. Before he could lower the weapon, another soldier burst through the entrance. Salomon clubbed him, then shot him. 4 more crawled under the tent flaps. He shot them too. The speed of the transition was terrifying. One moment he was sterilizing instruments. The next, he was engaged in close quarters combat inside a medical tent. But Salomon realized something that the terrified wounded men around him could not yet see. The perimeter was gone. The infantry had been pushed back. The aid station wasn't just under attack, it was being engulfed. He ordered the wounded to evacuate. "Get out," he told the orderlies. "Get them back to the regimental command post." It was a decision made with the same clinical precision he used to diagnose a fracture. He assessed the situation, determined the threat axis, and realized that for his patients to live, someone had to buy them time. The numbers were simple and terrifying. Dozens of wounded men moved slowly. The enemy moved fast. The equation required a variable to slow the Japanese advance. Salomon became that variable. He stepped out of the tent into the dawn light and saw the scope of the disaster. The Japanese charge was not a tactical maneuver, it was a flood. Men with bandages, men on crutches, men with no weapons at all were charging the American lines. Salomon rushed to a machine gun position nearby. The gunners were dead. The M1917 Browning heavy machine gun sat silent, its water jacket cooling, the ammunition belt feeding into the receiver. He had been an Eagle Scout. He had been a champion marksman in his youth. The muscle memory of aiming and firing, dormant during his years of dental school and practice, surged back. He sat behind the tripod, racked the bolt, and opened fire. What happened over the next undetermined span of minutes is a sequence of events that defies the standard narrative of medical non-combatants. A machine gun is a crew-served weapon. It requires a loader, a spotter, and a gunner to operate effectively. It requires coordination to manage the ammunition feed and the barrel temperature. Salomon operated it alone. He wasn't firing blindly. He was firing with the methodical, ruthless precision of a man who understood that every second he held the trigger down was another 10 yards of distance for the retreating wounded. The Japanese soldiers identified the threat immediately. The heavy rattle of the Browning was a magnet for every rifle and grenade in the sector. They swarmed toward his position. Salomon traversed the gun, sweeping the arc of the field. He saw them coming from the ravine, coming from the tall grass, coming over the bodies of their own fallen comrades. He didn't panic. He adjusted his fire. When the ammunition belt ran dry, he had to reload. A clumsy, desperate process for one man under fire, exposing himself to the enemy to feed the brass into the mechanism. He was hit. We don't know exactly when. A bullet, a piece of shrapnel. It didn't stop him. He kept firing. The Japanese soldiers, realizing a frontal assault on the gun was suicide, began to flank him. They crawled through the brush, trying to get within grenade range. Salomon spotted them. He swung the heavy gun, the water boiling in the jacket, and cut them down. He moved the gun. This is the detail that seasoned infantry officers later found difficult to comprehend. The M1917 weighs over 100 pounds with the tripod and water. Yet, realizing his position was being zeroed in on, Salomon dragged the weapon to a new vantage point to secure a better field of fire. He was bleeding. He was exhausted. He was alone. But he kept the gun singing. The retreat was chaotic, but it was successful. The wounded from the aid station, the orderlies, and the surviving infantry pulled back to the regimental reserve line. They looked back and could still hear the steady, rhythmic thumping of Salomon's machine gun. It was a heartbeat in the chaos, a signal that the dentist was still at work. Then, eventually, the gun went silent. The battle raged for days. It took the Americans time to retake the ground lost during the WWII charge. When the 165th Infantry finally pushed back to the site of the forward aid station on July 8th, the scene that awaited them was grotesque and awe-inspiring. They found Captain Salomon. He was slumped over the machine gun. His body was riddled with bullet wounds. Some reports said 24, others as many as 76. There were bayonet wounds indicating that even after he ran out of ammunition or was too weak to fire, the enemy had to close in to finish him. But it was not the condition of his body that stopped the advancing troops in their tracks. It was what lay in front of him. Piled in a semicircle around his position, clogging the fields of fire, were the bodies of Japanese soldiers. They were stacked in rows, mowed down as they tried to rush the lone gunner. The officers began to count. 1, 10, 50. By the time they finished the grim tally, the number stood at 98. 98 enemy soldiers. 1 dentist. The forensic reconstruction of the scene told a story of supreme tactical competence. Salomon hadn't just sprayed bullets, he had placed his shots. He had prioritized targets. He had shifted the gun to cover dead ground. He had effectively stalled an entire company of enemy troops by himself, buying the necessary minutes for the evacuation. Captain Edmund G. Love, the 27th Division historian, arrived at the scene. He examined the body. He examined the enemy dead. He realized immediately that he was looking at one of the most singular acts of valor in the history of the United States Army. He began the paperwork for the Medal of Honor. But here, the story of Ben Salomon intersects with the same institutional rigidity that plagued the early days of the Western Approach's tactical unit. Just as the Royal Navy struggled to accept that teenage girls could revolutionize anti-submarine warfare, the US Army struggled to process the idea of a medical officer acting as a lethal combatant. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was rejected. The reason cited was a rigid interpretation of the Geneva Convention. The interpretation held that medical personnel were non-combatants, and while they could use force to defend themselves and their patients, taking up an offensive weapon like a machine gun, a crew-served engine of destruction, technically violated their protected status. The board argued that awarding the Medal of Honor would be an admission that the US violated the Geneva Convention. It was a bureaucratic absurdity. Salomon hadn't seized the machine gun to lead an offensive. He had used it as a shield of last resort when the protected status of his hospital had been violated by 3,000 screaming enemy soldiers. The enemy had ignored the Red Cross. The army, however, could not ignore the rulebook. So Ben Salomon was erased, not from the memories of the men he saved, but from the official pantheon of the nation's highest heroes. The recommendation languished. It was kicked between committees. It was lost in the vast paper shuffle of the demobilization. Decades passed. The men who survived Saipan grew old. The story of the dentist who killed 98 soldiers became a legend in the dental corps, whispered in mess halls and recounted in professional journals, but formally unacknowledged by the country he died for. It followed the same arc as the innovations of the WWII, initial rejection by an establishment that couldn't reconcile the reality of the event with their pre-existing doctrine. It wasn't until the late 1990s that a new generation of advocates, including to Robert West of the USC Dental School, took up the cause. They argued, using the same forensic logic that Captain Love had used in 1944, that Salomon's actions were defensive. They pointed out that the convention allowed for defense against war crimes, and the slaughter of wounded patients in a hospital tent was a war crime. Finally, the resistance broke. On May 1, 2002, nearly 58 years after he died behind that machine gun, President George W. Bush presented the Medal of Honor to Dr. Robert West, who accepted it on Salomon's behalf. Ben Salomon had no living relatives. His line ended on Saipan. The citation, read aloud in the Rose Garden, officially corrected the historical record. It acknowledged what the soldiers on the ground had known in 1944, that courage does not check your military occupational specialty code before it manifests. Ben Salomon's story is a terrifying reminder of the thin membrane between civilization and chaos. He was a man of science, a man of healing, who found himself in a situation where the only tool left to save life was an instrument of death. He did not retreat into the comfort of his non-combatant status. He did not wait for orders. He saw the pattern of the attack. He understood the variables and he acted. Most institutions operate on the assumption that people will stay in their lanes. Dentists fix teeth. Infantrymen shoot machine guns. Admirals command fleets. But history is often pivoted by the people who refuse to stay in those lanes when the moment demands it. Like the teenage girls in Liverpool who outthought U-boat captains, Ben Salomon proved that when the system fails, the individual must step into the breach. He died alone, surrounded by the carnage he had wrought to save others. He saved the wounded, but he also saved something else, the idea that in the face of absolute horror, one human being, armed with nothing but a machine gun and a sense of duty, can hold back the tide. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and click notification bell so you don't miss the next story.